So why do you think teams should consider using distributed version control within a corporate environment?
Well, obviously the most obvious use for distributed version control is the typical open source project in perhaps a wide distributed environment where you've got people scattered around the globe. But when it comes to corporate development, where you've got perhaps a team in one or only a few locations and are working on these centralized systems, there are actually still some benefits to using a distributed system. The word distributed in DVCS is perhaps a little misleading in a way. Being distributed is one of the benefits you can get from the flexibility and the power that these systems give you, but actually being physically distributed it doesn't have to be part of the reason you're using it. The power it gives you from an individual developer's point of view, being able to commit anytime you like, being able to access the repository very, very quickly, those are worth a great deal even within this corporate environment. And then the aspects that you would normally associate with being distributed, having many clones and many forks of a repository which are being perhaps collaborated on with different pockets of developers. Those things are still useful in a corporate environment as well, because there are always situations where you may have your main authoritative repository where you're doing development on perhaps your stable version and your official development version, but sometimes there'll be ideas that you'll want to experiment with that you don't know whether they're going to fly or whether they're going to pan out in the end. And in a way, putting them in your main repository gives them a legitimacy which isn't really there. You really want to see how they go, and then if they don't work, then just pretend they never existed. You just get rid of them. But then later on, if they do work, you really want to be able to integrate those back into your main repository. So distributed systems, because they were designed to be distributed across the globe if necessary, are very, very good at handling that kind of scenario. You can fragment your repository off into these experimental forks, play with them for a while, and that can be a fairly long-term process as well. It doesn't have just to be a short, self-contained thing. And then later on, you can review whether that worked and then bring that back into your authoritative repository. And the whole process is very well managed. So it opens up a whole bunch of workflows that you perhaps wouldn't have been able to do in a centralized system where the merging is perhaps not as robust and you really can't separate out development as much as that from the centralized repository, because everything has to be in one place.
So although we use the term distributed, the actual team itself doesn't need to be distributed. It can work quite nicely within central team model.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the distributed word may only need to refer to the distribution of the repositories themselves, and distributed might mean just that there are multiple copies of it or multiple versions of it, even inside your own server farm. It doesn't have to be anywhere else other than that. So the distributed nature of it does give you the ability to distribute it globally if you want, but it still has many benefits just distributing it or creating many forks within your organization, which it can still be within the same boundaries as you would normally associate with a centralized system.
So if you're going to adopt one of the DVCS tools, does that mean just throwing away your Subversion repository?
Not necessarily. The advantage is you can convert very easily from Subversion to Git and Mercurial. They both have good conversion routines that have been used by a lot of projects, including ones that I've run. And it's not just a one-off process as well. You can continue to run your Subversion server and keep updating your copies, your conversions to Git and Mercurial, and even commit changes to your Git and Mercurial repositories and push them back as Subversion commits. So you can run these systems in parallel for quite a while just to evaluate how they go. There are limitations to that. You do have to be careful with particularly doing multiple branches while you're still pushing changes back to the Subversion repository. But it doesn't have to be a sort of instant cutover where one day you're running only Subversion and the other day you're running only Git and Mercurial. There can be a transition period where you can evaluate and see how things go.
So you can essentially have Subversion as your central repository, but with lots of distributed repos all the way around it then?
You can do that. I mean, it doesn't work quite as well as doing it with a fully native distributed system, because eventually everything is trying to go back into a Subversion server. So you are still limited by the fact that you can only have one strand of development for each of the branches that you've got on your Subversion repository. Everything has to be sequential when it comes to you pushing it back to that Subversion repository. So you don't have anywhere near the level of flexibility that you do if you've gone completely over to distributed version control, but at least it does allow you to evaluate the benefits that you get, at least at a local level, on your developers' machines. You can see the benefits of being able to commit immediately and being able to search the repository very quickly. So there are some benefits. It's not the whole story by any means, but it does give you a taste of it.
So do you think, I mean, it sounds like you can make the teams a lot more agile as well. Do you think it helps in that evolution of the agile process?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, if a few team members have an idea and they've no idea whether it's going to be something that you're going to want to put into your main product eventually, the process of them creating a new little workspace for themselves, whether that's in a branch or whether it's in a completely separate fork, they can do that extremely quickly and collaborate within themselves and really evaluate how that's going to work in practice. And that can continue for as long as it takes. When you're if you're using something like Subversion, if you're trying to collaborate with an experimental feature that you don't necessarily want to go back into your main authoritative repository, you're kind of on a ticking time clock because you're trying to exchange perhaps patches with each other, and there is a limit to how long you can do that before it becomes unmanageable to merge back in again. So when you're using a distributed system, you can create that fork, and that can be a long-running fork if you wish, and you can do regular merges between you can regularly synchronize your fork with the centralized authoritative repository, so you're not getting out of date as you would do perhaps if you were trying to run it completely separately. And at the end of the day, when you've finished, the merging process back into the authoritative repository, if you decide to do that, is actually very robust, and you don't have to worry quite so much that it's going to cause you problems.
So do you think DVCS is becoming a lot more popular in a lot of open source projects as well?
Yeah, I mean, open source is certainly where DVCS has taken off most quickly at the moment. I think a lot of people are then experiencing it either through open source or through social portals like Bitbucket. And when they realise that actually they're getting these benefits on these smaller projects or in these open source projects, that they start wanting to use it in their corporate environment as well. So I think there's a very good chance that there's going to be a lot more bubble up of developers saying, look, I'm very familiar with using distributed version control now, and I'd really like to be able to use it in my corporate development environment as well, because I feel more productive that way. I feel I can work faster. There's less barriers to getting things done. So I'm sure that over time that more corporations will be taking that on as well.
So there's some really great tools for distributed version control systems, and obviously the main ones are Git and Mercurial. What do you think the pros and cons are of those?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that comes up quite often. Git and Mercurial, they both have the same underlying principles, but they both have their own pros and cons just within that. So Git is perhaps slightly faster, and it's a little bit more flexible in some ways, particularly when it comes to dealing with local branches and dealing with staging your changes before you commit them. So that's quite useful. Mercurial, on the other hand, is a bit easier to learn if you come from a Subversion environment. It's the command names are quite similar. And it also is extensible without actually changing the code itself. You can add extensions. So if you have a specific requirement, it is actually possible to tack things on and to add that as well. There are schools of thought as to whether you should be using Git or Mercurial. My personal opinion is you should evaluate them both and decide for yourself which one is best for you, because they do have nuances about them which make them slightly different. But ultimately, they both work on the same principle, and they both give you, by and large, exactly the same benefits. So definitely worth looking at both.
Okay, Steve, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.